Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? I thought I might press the mute button before I started the show, just for fun, to see what it sounds like. It sounds like nothing. Good morning. It's Friday. It's February 7th. It's 2020. It's the radio show. It's time to go. It's February 7th. Oh, hey, next week at this time it'll be Valentine's Day. What a fantastic time to take your Valentine down to Mar-a-Lago for a seaside getaway. I don't know exactly what's going to be going on, but nothing special. I don't have anything planned yet for Valentine's Day. I guess I better get on that. Everybody work on that. Get your significant other boxes of candy, poison, like whatever. I've been reading a lot of articles lately. I guess the next big wellness wave, probably a good idea actually, is an anti-sugar thing. I don't know. My antenna are up on this. And it's been going on for a long time. Lots of people have been pointing out the various damages that sugar, refined sugar, does to you in the diet. I've just been seeing a wave of articles lately, and it's got me thinking about it. I wondered if, I might have to try an experiment and try some of these kick the sugar stuff. At least I wondered whether maybe it would help me in the morning with the frog in the throat if I wasn't having sugar. Or I don't know. It could be anything. I mean, it's such a mystery to me that I can't seem to solve it. And I don't know. I think it also could be mental at this point, because it seems to happen from about 9 in the morning to about 11 in the morning. And after that is really not that much of a problem. But maybe it's just exaggerated because there's a microphone in my face. But anyway, just alerting you to the new health trend. Everybody kick the sugar out of your life or whatever. I've been hearing that for years now. People used to say all the time, sugar is poison. It's literally poison for your body. In 100 years, we'll be aghast at what we did to ourselves and our children, giving them sugar breakfast cereals. It was absolutely the worst thing you could do. Of course, the codicil to that is that it's the industries that are promoting all this stuff and that have us have this upside down idea about what breakfast should be about. I even read in one of these new wave of sugar elimination articles, sugar eliminationists, they're extremists. We have to put a stop to it. That that the line that breakfast was the most important meal of the day apparently was actually like an advertising come on from a bacon company, oddly enough. Anyway, so they're not a sugary bunch. I guess there's a lot of sugar involved in curing bacon, though, isn't there? I don't know. Anyway, don't eat sugar. We are not sponsored by the sugar companies here, so I guess we're free to say that. We're not sponsored by anybody, so I don't know. Eat cement for breakfast. What the hell do I care? Anyway, I don't want you to die. I want you to be able to listen to the show, which we're doing now, live, according to Bill in Portland, Maine, who's feeding nuts to squirrels most mornings. They're usually sugar-free, so I don't know. He treats the squirrels better than we treat the rest. We treat ourselves. Daily Co's Radio is live now. To kick his show up a notch, it won't be sugar today. It'll be something else. It'll be Adderall. I'll snort Adderall live on the air. That is an excellent idea. That'll keep me more focused. I probably wouldn't have told you this story if I was snorting Adderall. Although I guess, I'm used to hearing about Adderall as an ADHD treatment, as opposed to crushing it and snorting it as the president does. And that doesn't seem to help him with ADHD at all. I guess he's just taking it for the stimulative effect. We could go that direction. Do you have to change the dosage? I wonder. Anyway, snort Adderall live on here. Unfortunately, he forgets to crush up the tablets first, and hilarity results. I'm feeling that pain in the back of my nose and the upper palate where the little pills get stuck. I'm already feeling the effects of this. All right, what's happening today? It's Friday. There's a lot to cover. We're not going to cover any of it. We're going to read things that are going to prepare you for the weekend, alarm you, catch you up on other things. We have to finish up the story of the money machine that we've been talking about the last couple of days. The backgrounder on Burisma and how it originally became an issue on the radar of Western democracies and regulators and money lenders as well. To this point, it hasn't involved Biden in the story, but Biden does appear in the story, and the story is not flattering to Biden. This is not a it wasn't a piece that was written with the idea of letting Biden off the hook or exonerating him or Hunter in these activities, but it does, I think, go a long way toward explaining what was actually going on with respect to at least what Joe Biden was doing in applying this pressure in Ukraine. But at the end, as you'll see, they do say, well, that was an awfully dumb thing for Hunter to do. It certainly didn't help. I mean, at the minimum, it didn't help Joe Biden deliver his message about corruption in the prosecutor general's office. It got in the way of that, and it made Ukrainians, to the extent that they knew anything about Burisma or Biden, or of course Hunter Biden, they almost knew nothing about, I'm sure. But if it came to their attention, it made them cynical about the American anti-corruption message and whether or not the message. I mean, the people were also anti-corruption. I'm sure they were glad to have lip service, but they were probably afraid that it was only going to be lip service again, because possibly if they had any idea that Hunter Biden was on the board, they might have thought that they weren't going to get any results from Joe Biden's pressure, although they did get those results. All right, so there's lots going on there, and there's reasons why it is important for the current news. And then there's a whole bunch of other things I'd like to share with you, more alarmist, and I think correctly alarmist, writing about manipulation of the elections through online shenanigans of various sorts. And, of course, also news about the way the president now feels liberated to crime even more. Yesterday was a remarkable day. I mentioned to you on the air yesterday that reports were coming in about just how unhinged his speech was to the National Prayer Breakfast, which is, it was outside of expectations, but that's the way it is always with Donald Trump. But then, of course, he gave his noon speech. I guess it was a weird thing. It wasn't, I don't know what kind of event it was. It ended up just being a celebration of his having been acquitted. And that too was unlike anything I've ever seen at the White House. But again, no surprise. That too, extraordinarily unhinged, extraordinarily unpresidential. But clearly you're not going to stop him. So, I don't know. Let's get to the readings, I guess. We'll squeeze it all in if we can. I guess the sooner we get to it, the sooner or the better the chances are that we'll actually finish up. Let's see. I kind of wanted to start with the money machine thing, but we'll do it. And I'll give you a brief recap of what we have learned so far from it while we scroll through it and try to find this. One thing that Pocket doesn't have is a bookmark, as far as I can tell, so you can lay down a marker for where you were last time, so you can begin reading one of these long read pieces again without delay. But what we were reading was The Money Machine, How a High-Profile Corruption Investigation Fell Apart, a long read in The Guardian from the UK. Oliver Bullough, Bullough, the author. And again, the date, somewhat important on this, April 12th, 2017. So we're into the Trump administration. The Trump administration hasn't yet, at this point, made an issue of Biden's activities in Ukraine because Biden is not yet clearly a candidate against Trump. But there has already been cause for cynicism about Biden's activities, mostly expressed by the so-called liberal media, of course. Sorting out our own, I suppose you could call it that, Biden is getting criticism by this time from the Washington Post, and perhaps even a little earlier. So the raw materials of the attack against Biden are there, and again, provided by the so-called liberal media. And it's not until later, though, that the Trump administration and allies run away with the story. So what we did learn, the reason why we think they ran away with the story, backgrounder here, was, for us, why read the story? The question, what is Burisma supposed to have done in all of this? We were just sort of handed the fact that Burisma and the oligarch who ran it were corrupt, and so therefore it would be problematic if, one, Hunter Biden worked for them, him/them, and at any point really, but of course while Joe Biden was vice president, and two, that without any other context, you might easily draw the conclusion that Joe Biden's pressure on the Ukrainian government to fire their prosecutor general was obviously a move calculated to protect Hunter Biden and the company he worked for and the company that was paying him from being caught up in scandal. Because, of course, we were told Burisma and the oligarch that runs it is corrupt. Who goes after people who are corrupt in Ukraine? It is the prosecutor general in Ukraine. And because we knew or were handed the fact that Burisma was corrupt and so was the oligarch who ran it, then certainly the prosecutor general, in investigating that corruption, which is what they do over there, would have turned up information damaging to Hunter Biden and therefore reflect poorly on Joe Biden, and Joe Biden therefore had the prosecutor general fired so that that wouldn't happen. Except, as we all also were learned and were handed just the same, really, the explanation from the other side was, well, the problem was that the prosecutor general's office was massively corrupt and was not investigating Burisma and other corruption stories, and therefore Western democracies, particularly, I guess, when I say Western democracies, that includes the outside organizations that they run, like the International Monetary Fund. Essentially, the idea of investing in Ukraine, which Western democracies had hoped to be able to promote because they were breaking away from the Eastern Bloc as a former Soviet republic, looking to distance themselves from Russia and westernize themselves and integrate themselves into a Western democratic tradition and economy, maybe even join the European Union and or NATO, and it was in the interest of those Western democracies to promote that, but they needed to rebuild their economy because it had been looted by a corrupt government for many years and in extreme fashion. But in order to, it was difficult to encourage either outside investment in Ukraine or Western governmental investment in Ukraine if there was significant worry about all of that help being drained away by corruption. So step one in integrating Ukraine into a Western mode and away from Russia, which would have been a very big geopolitical coup, was the elimination of this corruption problem that stood in the way of Western money and power doing this job. So that was the whole geopolitical background. The specific background here was, okay, well, the oligarch behind Burisma, who, again, I'm going to have to scroll through and make sure I get the names correct, but let's see if we can't get down to the part we read yesterday. I have to remind myself of the guy's name because it's Ukrainian and it's hard to remember. Mykola Zlochevsky. Remember this guy. So this is the oligarch who runs Burisma, among other businesses. The kernel of truth behind the story that he's corrupt, besides our just telling you that, was that he is in, among the many business interests he's got, natural gas. That's the Burisma business model. And he was tied to the the extraordinarily, apparently, corrupt Ukrainian politician Yanukovych. Yanukovych ran the government from two different angles. I think once as prime minister and then later, a few years later, as president. And both times, Zlochevsky went into government with him. Both times, and particularly the second time around, with a ministry portfolio bearing directly on the natural gas business he ran. And the allegation is that he awarded himself all sorts of drilling contracts and other government benefits that he converted into personal benefits through profits at Burisma, and that he then, like many other Ukrainian oligarchs, hid a significant portion of the funds he stole this way in Western banks, sometimes right in the middle of the banking and financial centers, as in London in this case, sometimes offshore, British Virgin Islands, Grand Cayman Islands, whatever, all the famous banking havens that allow you to hold money anonymously, pass it around between limited liability companies that are registered more or less anonymously, and where the governments don't keep records and don't demand records about the ownership behind the LLCs. So all the regular money laundering activities are going on here. And the UK, at some point, beginning in the 2010s and moving forward with this case to about 2014, is taking a leadership role among the Western democracies in announcing an initiative of tracking down these stolen monies, not just from Ukraine, but from other developing nations. But Ukraine is a special project here for the reasons previously mentioned. Tracking down stolen money that is sitting in Western banks and doing the prosecutorial legwork that it takes to freeze, seize, and return those assets to the new government of Ukraine so that it can help pay for the reconstruction of a stable Ukrainian government and a stable Ukrainian economy, and we won't have to do it. They're going to need billions of dollars to rebuild there and stabilize as a nation. We could give it to them, or if we find it stolen sitting in banks, particularly banks that we have some control over, why not freeze it, seize it, and pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine that way with its own money? And they will have an interest in doing that. It'll put them on their feet. They've just had a revolution kicking Yanukovych out of the country, and a revolution based on widespread popular frustration with corruption. So they'll obviously be interested in helping us out. They'll help us make the case. Britain begins to press the case against this French bank with a branch in London, BNP Paribas, to freeze $23 million that they believe is connected to Mykola Zlochevsky, and he confirms the fact by contesting the seizure in court, of course. But they also believe that it has been illegally gotten, that it's the proceeds of fraud and corruption in Ukraine. He contests this, of course. And so the Serious Fraud Office of the British government is in contact with the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine, seeking all of the evidence that they need in order to win their court case, seizing this $23 million. And it's pointed out along the way, this is also extraordinarily important to the story, is that this is actually a very small chunk, an extraordinarily small chunk of the money that's stolen either by Zlochevsky himself, by other Ukrainian oligarchs, by the government. It's in excess, it's several $billion, perhaps as many as several $100 billion are alleged to have been stolen. And so this was a test case, $23 million. And also the size is important in comparing, or I guess in questioning why it was that of all the corruption that we could have been concerned with in Ukraine, the total of what was it? I think a total of $1 million and over 6 years paid to Hunter Biden. That's really seriously small potatoes with respect to Ukrainian corruption. Anyway, so the British, and with the help of the United States, are pushing hard on the Prosecutor General's office, and there's one new official in the new government, now the Poroshenko government, which we were a little bit unsure about, who appeared to have sort of come from outside of all this, and by all indications was trustworthy to the Western democracies, who was running the investigation, this Casco fellow, Kasko, and he's responding to the letter from the British SFO, and he's the one that puts the pressure on in the Ukrainian government. Let's get serious and start cooperating about this and produce documents. What ends up happening, though, is the judge in the case in Britain ends up dismissing the case against Zlochevsky and returning the money to him because, he says, the government has failed to prove its case. It's all just conjecture, they say. But most curious in the decision are half a dozen references in the decision to a letter that the judge has gotten from the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine vouching for Zlochevsky and insisting that he is not suspected of any crime in Ukraine. And that's going to force, in this case, it ends up forcing the British judge's hand. Look, the only people who think he's guilty of this crime is the Serious Fraud Office. And while that's serious, it would help an awful lot if the Ukrainians actually thought he was guilty of a crime. That would help us establish that there was reason to believe this. I guess there's good reason to believe it in the Serious Fraud Office, but if the Ukrainians themselves, who are going to get this money, don't believe it, what are we supposed to do with that? And Casco is caught by surprise, of course. He says he knew, they must have known throughout the prosecutor's office that he was working furiously on helping the British with this case. How could someone in this office have written a letter vouching for Zlochevsky and blowing the case in the middle of all this? And he comes to the conclusion, obviously, that either the person who wrote it was either incompetent, corrupt, or both. Right? So this is about where we left off. I think we'll just sort of recap it here. Casco felt that these references to this letter was bizarre. Everyone, as he says, in a senior position at the prosecutor's office must have known he was leading a frenzied investigation into Zlochevsky. So how could anyone have signed off on a letter saying that no investigation was going on? The letter appeared to be crucial to the judge's ruling, which stated that Zlochevsky was never named as a suspect for embezzlement or indeed any other offense, let alone one related to the exercise of improper influence in the grant of exploration and production licenses. The total opposite of what should be being represented to the British court or anyone who asked about Burisma and corruption. On the surface, I guess you could take that and just run with it and say, well, you Republicans here now in the modern context say, well, obviously, Burisma was obviously corrupt. So therefore, Joe Biden something. And, you could just grab this and say, well, I have a letter here from the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office that says he's not corrupt, that he's not suspected of anything, ever, and never has been. So there's no basis for calling Burisma corrupt at all, and therefore no basis for calling Hunter Biden corrupt, and therefore no basis for calling Joe Biden corrupt. So case dismissed. Except the whole context of this story has set up for us the fact that, we're going to get around to this. As Casco saw it, his colleagues had failed to help him when he begged them to investigate Zlochevsky, but when it came to writing the letter to help the tycoon, he believed they had happily done so, and there were only three possible reasons why someone would do it: incompetence, corruption, or both. And that's really only two reasons. What's interesting here is, so far, no indication of who wrote the letter. Is there no signature on the letter? How come we don't get that? Anyway, according to Casco, we have this serious problem here. Whatever the explanation for this mysterious letter, the case highlighted a crucial flaw in countries' efforts to cooperate across borders. Even in the rare cases when the UK does freeze a foreign official's property, it's dependent for evidence from colleagues abroad who usually have, of course, fewer resources, less training, and, in the case of Ukraine, I would add, a decades-long tradition of institutionalized corruption. That means that any misconduct or incompetence by the Ukrainian prosecutors can undermine a case in the UK as surely as if the same actions were committed by the UK government itself through the SFO. That's about where we left off. Zlochevsky is not the only former Ukrainian official to have assets frozen abroad. As part of Western assistance to the new Ukrainian government, European countries have blocked the assets of Yanukovych and a couple of dozen others. The asset freeze was intended to give Ukrainian prosecutors time to investigate and prosecute, and thus prevent the individuals involved burying assets in their favorite tax havens. The totals involved, around $220 million in cash and property, would buy a lot of medicine and build a lot of roads, but still, by the way, not nearly as much as was thought to have been stolen. That was just the amount that they could identify and freeze. The man in Ukraine responsible for gathering the evidence against many of the individuals whose assets had been frozen is Sergei Gorbatyuk, head of the prosecutor's Special Investigations Department. When we met, this author says, in April last year, that would have been 2016, he looked tired and crumpled in a baggy gray suit. It was late in the evening, the only time he had free after a long day. And once again, a little extra time spent on how they look. But okay. Unusually for a high-ranking official in the prosecutor's office, he had a reputation for honesty, which is why several anti-corruption activists recommended that I talk to him. Our main problem is that these high-ranking officials' assets are all registered abroad. In Monaco, which has come up, Cyprus, which has come up, Belize, which really hasn't, or the British Virgin Islands, and so on. And we write requests to them. We wait for 3 or 4 years, and there's no response at all. And that's that, and it falls apart, he said. We'll be back with more on this story after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue on with this. We might, our recap takes the whole first segment, but I just feel like we need to drive this home, even though a lot of you have heard much of the story. Where we left off, though, was with Sergei Gorbatyuk, apparently a trusted source in the prosecutor's Special Investigations Department, pointing out that the problem is, of course, that the assets that are stolen are hidden abroad in offshore tax havens, and they write requests to them for information, and they wait sometimes for years if they get any response at all, and that's that. The case falls apart, he says. The asset has been re-registered 5 times just while we're waiting for an answer on the first questions, right? Okay, so people are pretty adept at hiding things, and it's an interesting analog to the game that, I don't know if it's immediately obvious to everybody because it's a totally different context and a totally separate game that they're playing, but the rules of the game are largely the same. You have to go through all of this bureaucratic nonsense to try and track down the assets, and it's very similar to the game we played in the House impeachment investigations with subpoenas and testimony from certain witnesses, where we were told, well, we won't appear because absolute immunity. And then you go and litigate that and you win, and they appeal it, and you win the appeal, and they appeal it again to the Supreme Court, and then you win at the Supreme Court maybe, and then they go back and say, well, that's all right, because I didn't mean absolute immunity, I meant executive privilege. And we do the whole thing over again, and you just keep running that play and delaying in courts for years until the administration finally leaves office, and then everybody drops it because, well, it's pointless to pursue this when they're out of office. Sometimes it takes 4 years, sometimes it takes 8, but you can make things last that long if you're willing to litigate complete nonsense. Anyway, and of course then they attacked the idea that their claims were complete nonsense in the prosecution or in the impeachment trial as well. That was a big talking point for them. How can you say that asserting your rights in this country is complete nonsense? Well, you're not asserting rights. You're making things up and calling them rights, and they don't exist, and it takes 2 years to get all the courts necessary to convince you that you've lost, to agree that that thing that you said protected you doesn't exist. And in your response to it as well, we'll just claim a different thing. This one does exist, but it's inapplicable. And then we'll take 2 years to get to that. And then you'll claim another one that is also inapplicable. And it goes on. And we've already been through that song and dance, and we did that with the George W. Bush administration when we wanted Harriet Miers and Josh Bolton to testify about the U.S. attorneys' scandals. And we know where that leads. Similar game being played here. While the offshore tax haven is delaying in responding to prosecutors' requests about an asset that they've identified as having been stolen from Ukraine, the thief who stole it from Ukraine in the first place re-registers the asset 4 or 5 times to make it impossible to track down, even if they get an answer that says, oh yes, that person did steal that and did own it, and that was the right company name that it's being held by, but that company has been dissolved. Well, what happened to its assets? Well, write us a letter and we'll tell you. And then 3 years later, we say it went to company B over here, but that too has been dissolved in the time it took us to write to you. And you get how this goes on and on. Even when foreign officials did reply to his letters, Gorbachev explained he then had to find a way to understand what they had written, an additional layer of bureaucracy. The authorities in Monaco, for example, had forwarded him 4,000 pages of documentation relating to one oligarch in French, Arabic, and English, which he had received 8 months previously, but was yet to read, because, of course, he speaks Ukrainian, and probably Russian as well. The official translators had waited 4 months to tell him they were too busy to do the job. Then an outside contractor proved incapable of managing it, and he says his bosses kept blocking the other suggestions that he brought them. This is insanity of our whole system. This is everywhere. I get the impression no one wants anything to happen, he said. That sounds problematic, right? And if previous cases are any guide, progress will continue to be slow. In one of the few examples of a Ukrainian corruption-related charge that has gone to court, ex-Prime Minister Pavlo Larazenko, I don't think we've even heard that name, was found guilty in California in 2004 of money laundering and sentenced to 97 months in prison. I am not familiar with that case. But again, what's been interesting is that it's been clear that you can't prosecute these guys in Ukraine, so it has fallen to the UK and the US, when they think they have a case, to prosecute these things. And of course, this would have been 2004. That would have been under the George W. Bush administration, a Republican administration, actually concerned about corruption in Ukraine and finding the ex-prime minister there guilty and sentencing him to 97 months in prison, as opposed to, say, doing nothing in the Trump administration and or even participating in the corruption when possible. Lazarenko had fled Ukraine back in 1999 when he fell out of favor with the then president. I don't know who it was at the time. You could track it down on Wikipedia if you like. He tried to claim asylum in the United States, interestingly, but instead became the first foreign leader convicted of laundering money through the American financial system. I wonder if he was the last. Although the conviction was successful, the asset recovery process remains blocked. A total of $271 million of Lazarenko's money is frozen in Guernsey Antigua, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Lithuania. But Washington has been unable to recover it for a decade. He's got $271 million. The Burisma case here was over a chunk of $23 million. We shouldn't impeach Donald Trump for his massive corruption because, whataboutism for Hunter Biden is over $1 million. And these, even the $271 million, that's just one ex-prime minister's assets that we've been able to identify as seizable. It is not a credible claim that you are attacking corruption in Ukraine if you're going after $87,000 or $50,000 chunks at a time. It's just not a serious effort. You should stop claiming that it is, except that you're never going to get the liars to stop doing that. Anyway, so they've been unable to recover this Lazarenko's money for over a decade, and that's not unusual. The World Bank has an asset recovery database which shows that cases have dragged on in Western courts for more than 10 years in connection to money from Liberia, El Salvador, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Philippines, Zambia, and elsewhere. In evidence submitted to a parliamentary committee last year, the Serious Fraud Office said the obstacles put in its path by offshore jurisdictions were a key cause of these delays. Top-tier defendants are highly sophisticated and operate internationally. They are likely to be acutely aware of the jurisdictions with an environment that is favorable to them. Apparently that's Cyprus, for some strange reason, for Ukrainian oligarchs. And also for some strange reason, the Secretary of Commerce of the United States of America owns a bank in Cyprus. I don't know. Just weird. That's all. So as we said, they're likely to be acutely aware of places where the environment is favorable to them, and from which it's very difficult and in some cases impossible to either trace benefit or recover assets, the SFO said. Such defendants are also likely to be astute in their use of financial products and other devices which they use to disguise their economic benefit from any crime. On March 8th, 2015, David, another Ukrainian last name, Sakvarelidze, I guess. David Sakvarelidze. That's what we'll go with. Then Ukraine's first deputy general prosecutor appeared on a Ukrainian news program and made a dramatic accusation. Shall we? We'll give him some dramatic music for that. How about this? That's a good one. Okay, so he made a dramatic accusation that Ukrainian prosecutors had taken a bribe to help Zlochevsky. Right, so that's what everybody suspected here. So again, Zlochevsky is the Ukrainian oligarch who owned Burisma / was the natural resources minister and allegedly did some self-dealing to steal millions of dollars and stashed it away in the UK. At this point here, we're talking about a $23 million chunk that they're going after. So he thinks that Ukrainian prosecutors had taken a bribe to help him. And that's, I guess, how a strange letter showed up in the hands of the judge in the UK saying he's not guilty of any crime. We think he's great. And the charges were dismissed. The source for Sakvarelidze's his claim, was an unnamed foreign consultant, that doesn't sound good, working with Ukrainian law enforcement. A high-ranking official in the prosecutor's office told him the consultant he suspected that let me try this again here. The source of his claim was an unnamed foreign consultant working within Ukrainian law enforcement. A high-ranking official in the prosecutor's office told the consultant, that he suspected that one official had taken a bribe of $7 million, Sakvarelidze alleged in his television appearance. It's shameful, of course. People like that should not represent this country. Now, it's noted parenthetically here that Sakvarelidze did not respond to interview requests for this article. The allegation has not been proven, but it is the subject of an investigation by the newly established National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. And that's a thing. And it's been important in our discussions, or in impeachment discussions anyway. Sakvarlidze, an ethnic Georgian, had been hired just 2 weeks earlier to help clean up the law enforcement system, and he set to work. Progress was slow, however. In fact, it was so slow that the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, that's an important job, although in this case it's held by Jeffrey Pyatt. That's Joffrey, like Jeffrey, Geoffrey, Pyatt, P-Y-A-T-T. U.S. ambassador to Ukraine decided to make an astonishingly forthright interjection. I mean, that could be like dramatic too. So, again, progress was so slow that the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, Jeffrey Pyatt, decides to step in and said in September of 2015, speaking in the southern Ukrainian city of Odessa, which has got a reputation, of course, Pyatt stated that prosecutors were asked by the UK to send documents supporting the seizure of the $23 million, Zlochevsky's $23 million, but instead sent letters to Zlochevsky's attorneys attesting that there was no case against him. Those responsible for subverting the case by authorizing those letters should, at a minimum, be summarily terminated, he said. This is the U.S. ambassador speaking at this point. The allegation was part of a long and damning speech in which he laid out just how little Ukraine had reformed its law enforcement bodies, something that makes recovering the millions stashed overseas unlikely, if not impossible. This is a rather extraordinary step, and presumably done with the blessing of the United States government, run at the time by Barack Obama and Joe Biden, right? So that's an extraordinary step out for the U.S. ambassador to make. Ukraine's national finances are currently dependent on the International Monetary Fund, where the dominant voice belongs to the United States. Pyatt was not just any ambassador, therefore, but the local representative of the government's paymaster. That's one way of putting it. He was putting Ukraine on notice. Sort out the prosecutor's office because America is getting annoyed. Sounds familiar. I mean, and a forceful and blunt message at that, right? But it didn't work. Rival prosecutors opened criminal cases against two of Casco's investigators and their allies in other institutions. Sadly, the protection racket we uncovered turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg, Sakvarlidze wrote on Facebook in October of 2015. Change could only be won when international lenders forced President Poroshenko to act. It was tough talk from the West that obliged Ukraine's parliament, long referred to sarcastically as the biggest business club in Europe, to create the Anti-Corruption Bureau and a dedicated anti-corruption prosecution service. And it was only the bluntest of language from U.S. officials that forced the Ukrainian government to fire crooked prosecutors. Now you know where you're going with all this, right? You see what's coming next. Again, this is 2015 that this is happening, but this is an article written in April 2017, before it becomes a talking point for the Trump administration, an attack point from the Trump administration. They note that the only way to save this situation is the bluntest possible language from American officials. According to a valedictory interview by the former Vice President, Joe Biden, in The Atlantic, Poroshenko only sacked the lawman blocking Casco's reforms because Biden made a direct threat. And this is, well, you know what the line is. This is how it's been used. Of course, you know how it's been used by the Trump administration. Oh, this is evidence of Biden's corruption. But read this whole article. What leads up to this? This is Biden doing the work of the entire democratized West, the entire capitalist democratized West here. Petro, you're not getting your $1 billion, Biden said. He told Ukrainian president, you can keep the prosecutor general, just understand we're not paying if you do. Well, it's a quid pro quo. I see what you mean. We do those things all the time. I see what you mean there too. Of course, what's being done here is the entire democratized capitalist West says, this guy's just got to go. And Joe Biden says, I acquiesce in that position. He does have to go. I will carry that message forward. And if we are successful in pushing this corrupt prosecutor out, Ukraine should be able to recover millions upon millions of dollars worth of stolen assets that can go back to Ukraine and build infrastructure, pay for medicines, schools, etc., all the things that Ukraine needs. It inures to the benefit of Ukraine, not to the benefit of Joe Biden. Could that be a major difference? Yes, I think so. Biden was Washington's point man on Ukraine, you've heard that many times, throughout the Obama administration, and consistently encouraged reformers and chided their opponents. In a speech in Ukraine's parliament in December of 2015, he said the country could not hope to reform itself on European lines or regain its money if it did not do something about its entrenched corruption. So Biden went to Ukraine and made a speech to their parliament about fighting corruption. Trump sat on his ass and did nothing. But Trump is always sitting on his ass and doing nothing, so no different there. You cannot name me, Biden said, a single democracy in the world where the cancer of corruption is prevalent, he told Parliament. It's not enough to set up a new anti-corruption bureau and establish a special prosecutor fighting corruption. The office of the Prosecutor General desperately needs reform. By then, well, as he said, the office of the General Prosecutor. I've seen it written both ways there, so I'm a little confused by that. I don't know what the actual title is, but it's written in Ukrainian. By then, however, almost 2 years had passed since the revolution, and many Ukrainians had become disillusioned. And, here's the problem, the credibility of the United States was not helped by the news that since May of 2014, Biden's son Hunter had been on the board of directors of Burisma, Zlochevsky's company. We need to be reminded in this article because this is from 2017. The White House insisted the position was a private matter for Hunter Biden and unrelated to his father's job, but that is not how anyone I spoke to in Ukraine interpreted it. Hunter Biden is an undistinguished corporate lawyer with no previous Ukraine experience. Why would a Ukrainian tycoon hire him? And that, of course, is all of the questions that Trump allies ask. And the answer is probably pretty simple, too. Burisma was in trouble with lawsuits across the West that were aimed at grabbing the oligarchs' funds, freezing it, and sending it back to the government of Ukraine, depriving him of the use of it. And he probably thought it would be useful for a company that is being credibly accused of facilitating my corruption to have connections across the West. I mean, there's probably, I don't think anybody even on the Democratic side has doubts about what the purpose of hiring him was. I guess the question is whether it influenced Joe Biden, and apparently it did not, because, it only works for Republicans who don't care if their argument makes any sense. Well, he hired Hunter Biden so that Joe Biden wouldn't bother us about our corruption. But then Joe Biden was the biggest pest from the West that there was about corruption. Well, in that case, what he was really trying to do was not fight against corruption. He was trying to encourage corruption. And how do you mean that? Well, he was trying to fire the prosecutor, and everyone knows what prosecutors do. They hunt corruption. Not these prosecutors don't. Well, you don't know that, and neither do any Americans, because they don't know the backstory of the Ukrainian governments that have preceded this one. And they don't know the backstory of the Prosecutor General's office sending letters vouching for Ukrainian oligarchs in Western courts when they're finally identified as thieves and the money is being stolen back. So it's an easy narrative for them to explain. No one knows off the bat that the prosecutors in Ukraine are the corruption we're talking about, rather than vice versa. But anyway, it doesn't look good, so here they go. Hunter Biden failed to reply to questions I sent him, but he told the Wall Street Journal in December of 2015 that he had joined Burisma, quote, to strengthen corporate governance and transparency at a company working to advance energy security, unquote. And that was no doubt something that the company told him when they hired him. Why do you want to hire me? He must have asked the question. Why me? Even though he knew the answer. What he was asking was, what should I tell people with respect to why I'm working here? And the answer is, well, corporate governance. Well, and it makes a certain amount of sense. Ukraine as a country is trying to integrate into Western democracy and the Western economy. But they have an enormous problem, not just corruption, but that they have no experience in Western economies. And so it would make a certain amount of sense for any company of any size to say, well, what we really need to do is, in order to Westernize, let's bring Western business people, even if it's Hunter Biden and he's not a Western business person per se, that's a separate story. But let's get Western business people on board here to teach our board members how to Western capitalist, how is business run in the capitalist West? What do we're used to a different tradition. What are the sorts of things that that we can change in our corporate governance that will give Western investors and Western democracies confidence that we're running things on the up and up here? Which, by the way, could just as easily be read, well, what are the sorts of corruptions that Western investors and Western democracies will expect in our corporate system? Because yes, there are plenty. For instance, ones we've talked about all the time, favoring shareholders over stakeholders in the way profits are dispersed, in how to exploit workers such that we can pay them the lowest possible wages and give them the minimum possible job security and kick all that money up to board members and they can steal it and take it home themselves. Those are the expected kinds of corruption in the West. And we have the same goals as the West, so we're in good shape there. We don't have to convince anybody that the money has to go in some other direction. We just want to know, how does the West steal it and make it kosher? So we brought corporate governance people in. Now, Hunter Biden may or may not have actually known anything about that stuff, but he had the added benefit of a name that was known and recognizable. But and that's not a good thing. It's in fact a wrong thing. However, it is among the accepted sorts of corruption that makes Western democracies and capitalist investors comfortable because they understand how it works and they know where money will be flowing and they like predictability. And they also know, good, I'm glad they recognize names that are worth paying lots of money to because I have one of those names and maybe they'll pay me lots of money. But it didn't look good, as we said here. So this explanation that he offered up I joined to strengthen corporate governance and transparency at a company working to advance energy security. This was not an explanation that many people found reassuring. The Washington Post, again, the so-called liberal media, was particularly damning, it says, quoting them as saying, the appointment of the vice president's son to a Ukrainian oil board looks nepotistic at best, nefarious at worst. It wrote, shortly after Hunter Biden's appointment, you have to wonder how big the salary has to be to put U.S. soft power at risk like this. Pretty big, we'd imagine. And I'm sure there's some tensions there that needed to be worked out. And probably, in all likelihood, Hunter's feeling pretty bad about this whole thing. And maybe Joe at some point said to him, even if you did nothing wrong here, I hope you're happy with yourself. You may have ruined everything, not just for me, but maybe for everybody, like in the whole world. But okay, enough with that. Even if it's 100% corrupt, it's still not a whole lot of money. It doesn't even rank as corruption by Ukrainian standards, quite honestly. But okay, it didn't look good, but you still have a long way to go to establish that there was actual serious corruption here. Especially if you're going to let that trip up your pursuit of even minor actual Ukrainian corruption, like this $23 million prize they were going after. In September last year, that would have been again 2016, a court in Kyiv canceled the arrest warrant against Zlochevsky, ruling that prosecutors had failed to make any progress in their investigation. That same month, the Latvian media reported that Ukraine had not helped a police investigation into money laundering, so $50 million, 50 million frozen euros had passed into the Latvian state budget instead of being returned to Ukraine. I guess the Latvians not too unhappy about that. I get the impression our foreign partners are disappointed by our failure to make progress tackling corruption, and that's why they are paying us less attention, said Kagro, who is now back in private practice, as he was during the Yanukovych years. Meanwhile, President Poroshenko's approval rating is stuck in the low teens. He has failed to fulfill his promise to sell off his business empire, and was revealed in the Panama Papers leaks to be still engaged in structuring his assets offshore. His London law firm has recently been sending out threatening letters to journalists, tempted to repeat accusations of corruption leveled at him by a former insider who has fled to the UK. Kagro resigned on February 15th of 2016, accusing the prosecutor's office of being, you'll never guess, a hotbed of corruption. Isn't that something? Sakvardledzi was sacked a month later. Sakvardledzi was sacked, that's funny. And charged himself with a gross violation of the rules of prosecutorial ethics. Wow, it's almost as if it was in fashion in Ukraine for corrupt government officials to use the levers of government to accuse their accusers of corruption, so as to undermine them in their quest to end Ukrainian corruption. What do you know? The whole reforming team came and went without jailing anyone or recovering a single oligarch's foreign fortune. That is rather unfortunate. Kagro told me he had resigned because he saw no point in waiting around impotently while his superiors undermined his cases. I didn't want to stay there like the Queen of England and watch. I thought that was an unnecessary shot at the Queen of England, but not inaccurate. The biggest problem in the prosecutor's office is corruption. Sakvardledzi and I went in to fight against it, and they threw us out. Last year, Kagro's successor formally apologized to the SFO on behalf of the Ukrainian prosecutor's office for its role in the failure of the case of the $23 million. There's still a bit more. We'll continue on with it. I told you it was a long read. After this. All right. Pardon me. Welcome back. My goodness. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, and to my efforts to keep things clear. All right. There is a bit more to this long and drawn-out story. But as we left off here, all of the reformers who were a part of the efforts to clean up the corruption in the, to track down the stolen money ferried out of the country by Ukrainian oligarchs and the corrupt prosecutors who protected it, all comes to naught, and they all end up having to leave the prosecutor's office and go back into the private world. All in all, the UK chose an unfortunate way to demonstrate, quote, a strong commitment to the people of Ukraine, as Theresa May stated in April of 2014. And I imagine that their commitment to the people of Ukraine is going to get even weaker now that they have replaced Theresa May with, although at this point she was not the prime minister, but I guess, I don't remember what her title was, but she was in charge of this anti-corruption effort there. So Theresa May and Joe Biden, both horrible people, according to the Trump administration. I guess they haven't really come down on Theresa May on this. But anyway, now that Theresa May, who went on to become prime minister, has been replaced by Boris Johnson, who himself rose to power with a lot of the same connections and with a lot of the same help as Donald Trump, it should be no surprise to anyone that neither Trump nor Johnson has any interest in helping Ukraine, who just happens to be in the sights of, the source of the help that put both Johnson and Trump in office, Russia. Okay, moving on. Yes, so the U.S. chose an unfortunate way to demonstrate a strong commitment to the people of Ukraine, but this unseemly episode highlights many of the reasons why so little of the cash stolen from poor countries is ever returned to them. Money can flow unhindered between countries, but police officers cannot. So it is always more difficult to prosecute a crime than to commit one, which is itself an interesting jumping off point. Think about that. So money can flow unhindered between countries, but police officers cannot. So it's always more difficult to prosecute a crime than to commit one. We've actually talked about that phenomenon in a different context in the past, just about what the nature of capitalism, not as a critique necessarily as an economic system, but that why capitalism is capitalism. Why is it called capitalism? Couldn't it be called any number of other things instead, a different sort of ism? But it's capitalism because capital is chief in all of this. Why is it given the privileged position that it is? In other words, as we've talked about and we just mentioned earlier about our own acceptable forms of business corruption in the West here, preferring payments to stockholders, shareholders in particular, rather than stakeholders. Why do we pay the money men first rather than the people who provide the labor that it could be equally said, or it could be said is equally necessary in order to produce whatever profits it is you're churning out in your company? Labor and capital together make this possible. Why prefer capital over labor? And I think years ago when we discussed this, the theory was, well, capital is just that much easier to convert and transport. It's a lot more portable than the labor is, and therefore a lot more flexible and impactful because it can be brought to bear in so many different ways. Labor can provide only labor. Capital can do all sorts of things. It can buy the equipment. It can purchase the labor. It can purchase the property on which the capital and labor are combined to create the profit. It can do various things to boost profits. It can do so much more. It's much more flexible. So it stands to reason, at least in the abstract argument, that that's where, if you have to draw the line somewhere and you have to favor one side or another of the equation, favor the side that is the more powerful because it's the more flexible. And one of the things it can do is move across borders. Not only can police not necessarily move so easily to chase money across borders, but similarly, labor can't move as freely across borders to provide, to put the muscle behind manufacturing efforts, or to move where the wages are better, for that matter, or where there's some other relative advantage to producing in some other country. That's why one of the big organizing principles of the European Union was the free movement of labor and capital. And I believe they put labor first in that listing, and I don't know whether that was symbolic in any way, but among the member nations of the European Union, that was a major founding tenet. And now, of course, in the immigration context, it's being used against them by nationalists and white supremacist nationalists at that. Anyway, as we were we departed, we should go back to the text of the article. Money can flow unhindered between countries, but police officers and labor cannot. So, always more difficult to prosecute a crime than to commit one. And of course, you can legalize some of those crimes and make it even easier, so that not only there'd be no reason for police to pursue them across borders, but laborers also can't cross borders in order to claim a bigger share of it in a different jurisdiction. Anyway, at the start of each year, Ukraine budgets for the money that it plans to reclaim from its deposed rulers. Very hopeful, right? And at the end of the year, activists from the Anti-Corruption Action Center, a non-governmental organization that oversees recruitment of Ukraine's new anti-corruption detectives, they all calculate how much of that money prosecutors actually found. In the first 9 months of 2016, the government intended to confiscate $250 million. Pounds in this case. They actually retrieved just 4,500 pounds, or 0.0018% of the planned total. They are not alone in struggling to get a grip on fraud. In its report to Parliament last year, the SFO said it was failing to retain key investigators in the face of competition from banks, private investigators, and other well-resourced city companies. That'd be London, of course. Something that complicates already tricky cases. If even the SFO considers itself under-resourced and outgunned in the battle against the kleptocrats and their offshore empires, then the problem is still more severe in Ukraine. Things are likely to get worse as the window of opportunity provided by enthusiastic foreign assistance is closing fast. And especially now that you can, quote-unquote, get in trouble for being that international assistance, well, who's going to stick their neck out now? Joe Biden is gone now from the White House, although Hunter remains on the Burisma board as of the writing of this article, but he is now off the Burisma board. And Pyatt has left Kyiv for new ambassadorial posting. With Donald Trump in power, the tiresome American pressure for reform in Ukraine may well be a thing of the past. No, he's even more dedicated to fighting corruption. Wink, wink. Instead, this is very interesting. This is before we knew what he was going to do with this whole thing, right? With Donald Trump in power, the tiresome American pressure for reform in Ukraine may well be a thing of the past. Not only that, but Donald Trump would bring pressure to bear on Ukraine to help them, or to help him frame up the people who actually once stuck their necks out to help Ukraine. Isn't that really amazing? How would you like to be elected on a reform ticket in Ukraine, and the first thing that the President of the United States, the so-called President of the United States, tells you is, I need you to manufacture evidence of corruption against the last American official who actually tried to help your country address its corruption problem. In other words, I need you to do to Joe Biden what your predecessors did to Casco and Sakvarlidze and others who came in and tried to clean up the corruption in Ukraine. They were buried under false accusations of corruption. That's how I know you can do this stuff in your country. And I know you were elected on the opposite ticket, the opposite platform. But if you want money from us, I need you to break all your promises to the people of Ukraine and do exactly what the previous corrupt governments that you ran against did, but do it to an American. How would you like that? Well, that would be pretty upsetting, I would think. Among European allies, France and Germany have elections this year. Again, this was 2017, and thus other things to worry about, as of course does post-Brexit Britain. When I sought comments on what the government was doing now to help Ukraine regain its assets, I was batted back and forth between the Home Office and the Foreign Office for a few days before they eventually provided a joint statement sourced to a, quote, government spokesperson, confirming that Britain was committed to everything it had always been committed to. So, in other words, a statement that meant essentially nothing. The UK is a strong supporter of the Ukrainian government's reform process, and in particular the fight against corruption, which needs to proceed quickly, they said, by email. That is undoubtedly true, but sadly the global situation is looking ever less favorable. Ukrainian politicians have consistently failed to keep their resolutions without foreign governments stiffening their resolve, and with that pressure fading away, there will now be little to stop them returning to their old ways. The old oligarchs appear to be feeling as secure as they have done for a while, and Ukrainians who have long been on the defensive are reaching out for new friends. On January 19th, the day before Trump's inauguration, Zlochevsky's gas company announced it was becoming a funder of the Atlantic Council, a prominent Washington think tank. The Atlantic Council declined to say exactly how much money the tycoon had offered, only that his donation had been between $100,000 and $249,000. A month later, Burisma hired a new director. Joseph Kofer Black does not appear to have any more experience of Ukraine than his colleague Hunter Biden, but as an ex-ambassador, and he wasn't actually the ambassador to any particular country. I think he was an ambassador at large for counterterrorism. As an ex-ambassador and a former director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center under George W. Bush, he is likely to have lots of useful contacts in Washington, which is, of course, all the reason that Hunter Biden was selected. Zlochevsky's last public appearance was in June of 2016 at a Burisma-organized alternative energy forum co-hosted in Monaco by Prince Albert II, who made the keynote speech. Monaco, of course, came up in a lot of Pam Bondi's complaining about Burisma and the nature of Hunter Biden's employment there. You may recall that the complaint was that the oligarch running Burisma, Zlochevsky, in other words, had paid Biden to do this sweetheart job, that Biden almost never went to Ukraine for board meetings. One of the meetings was held in Monaco. And then Hunter Biden went on a fishing trip in Norway with Joe Biden's family. You remember that one? That's where Monaco came up. Photographs of the event showed Hunter Biden posing with various comfortably retired ex-politicians wearing a blue suit. They love this description stuff. Twinned with highly polished brown shoes. Zlochevsky was tanned and healthy in an open-necked shirt, while a more formally dressed Prince Albert placed a solicitous hand on his back. And that's that. That's the end of the article, the long read. How interesting was that? Did that fill in the blanks for a lot of us? I think so. Gave us a lot more context to work with if you find yourself arguing over the Burisma suspicions, and a lot more sensible background information to help explain exactly how it is and why it is that we say that the Trump administration and their allies in the Trump campaign stood the reality of the Ukraine situation on its head here. But, there's no convincing them of that, probably because of what's in another story that we could and should share with all of you today. And this one, a lot more recent, and has gotten a lot more notice. And I feel like we're going to dive into it, and we're not going to get to so many other amazing things that should be discussed for the weekend. So maybe a quick roundup of other things for you to think about during the weekend. Big story this morning from David Farentholt, and it's always exciting when there's a David Farentholt story here. The new development here is that they've tracked down some exact numbers on what we have always thought Trump was up to. He tweets it this way. New. Real Donald Trump's company, he went with the Twitter handle there, Donald Trump's company charges Trump's own Secret Service agents while they protect him. We've known that, right? At rates as high as $650 a night for a room at Mar-a-Lago and $17,000 a month for a cottage at Mar-a-Lago. Taxpayers, of course, pick up the bill. It's attached to his piece on the subject, but there's more, and I guess a separate sidebar story appears in his second tweet in the thread here. We didn't know until now what rates Donald Trump charges his own government because the payments to the Trump Organization aren't listed in regular spending databases. Here's how we figured this out. That's a second story. But there is still a ton we don't know. Hopefully, he says, we'll unravel more of the mystery as the year goes on, but we need your help. There is another tweet here, which I think he added to this, as I tweeted afterwards, like, I was told, by the way, that we were going to be spared all this expense because the quote-unquote president was a quote-unquote billionaire and owned the properties himself, so we, the taxpayers, wouldn't have to pay all these charges. We were going to get away with it scot-free, right? The big complaint, Obama, he's always going on vacation. How much is that costing the government? Well, I won't be doing that. First he said I won't be golfing, and of course that turned out to be a lie. But there was also the story that they told that, when Trump goes on vacation, he'll be going to Trump properties. So we won't have to pay the rent on a vacation home, as I think might have been the case with Obama when he went to Martha's Vineyard. I think that they stayed in someone, and I don't know whether they rented that place or whether maybe a donor, like a campaign donor, might have offered it up to him for free, but I think that's illegal. They might have to pay some arm's length transaction here. And there might have been a rental fee. But in addition, of course, all the security that goes with him, and it does, it costs money. We acknowledge that. But we also acknowledge that normal presidents who actually work for a living probably deserve a break from time to time. But we weren't going to be spared all of that because Donald Trump was a billionaire and owned his own vacation property, so we wouldn't have to rent it from anybody. And the Secret Service, of course, could just stay there for free because even though they were hotel rooms, he owned the hotel, so he could just put them up for free. And as Farenthold himself points out in a later tweet here, this directly contradicts what Donald Trump's son Eric said last year, that the Trump organization gives the government rooms for free, meaning the cost of housekeeping. Instead, which is not free, by the way, of course, and shouldn't be free, but that just was more illustration of how they are fast and loose with the terms. Well, we'll give it to them for free. Well, I mean at cost. Well, I mean what we say the costs are. And who knows what they say the costs are. So we're going to give them for free, meaning the cost of housekeeping. Instead, the Trumps have charged rates as high as $650 a night for one hotel room. So, we knew they were doing that, but now we have some solid proof and some documentation from David Farenthold. No time to actually read it, but I'll give you those articles. You can take a look at them over the weekend. We'll probably get back to that on Monday after things develop. Let's see. Other items which should probably be mentioned, I guess because of the Trump properties thing, I'll go back and mention a slightly older story, unrelated except that it involves Trump properties and craziness. Washington Post report from that was recently recirculated and came to my attention, even though it too is a 2017 entry. Just wanted to throw this one out there because I wanted to make mention of it on an offhanded way. Hackers have been stealing credit card numbers from Trump's hotels for months. And it's not just the hotel in D.C., but as it turns out, it's sort of a rampant problem, and it certainly was back in 2017. I don't know if they've done anything about it, but guests at 14 Trump properties, 14, including hotels in Washington, New York, and Vancouver, have had their credit card information exposed, marking the third time in as many years that a months-long security breach has affected customers of the chain of luxury hotels. The latest instance, remember this is a 2017 article, was between August 2016 and March of 2017, according to a notice on the company's website, that included guest names, addresses, phone numbers, credit card numbers, expiration dates, the whole works. The breach took place on the systems of Sabre Hospitality Solutions, a reservation booking service used by Trump hotels, but did not compromise the Trump hotels system. And yet all of their guests were targeted and had their credit cards stolen. And who's big into that? Russian mafia. No big deal. Whatever. Just pointing that out. Spending no more time on it than absolutely necessary. Other stuff that I really wanted, I thought I wanted to spend some time on in continuing with the Iowa caucuses story. A lot of great research and writing about the weirdness surrounding the insistence on using a specialized phone app to do all this calculation work. I mean, on the surface, you can say pretty easily, I think, not really necessary, but you could see why somebody would be in love with the idea of doing it. But as it turns out, of course, the contract to build the app was awarded in ways that you would hope it wasn't, but it really was. And it's just sort of one of those stories that makes you say, why do I get out of bed in the morning? And David Dayen wrote a good one, I think, for the prospect here. And we'll indulge our non-FCC status by reading the actual title of the thing. It's not me embellishing it. Welcome to the Bullshit Economy. The Iowa caucus disaster is a function of a broken economic structure that rewards con artistry over competence. And I don't know that I would necessarily come to the same conclusion, but it's always worth giving a look at what David Dayen has to say about these sorts of situations. Points will be well taken. I am sure of it. Speaking of the Iowa debacle, we should also note for the record, as I saw yesterday and didn't get to and then felt bad because it became a big story as the day went on, it turns out that the hotline for calling in your results or reporting any problems at the Iowa caucuses was somehow, the hotline number was leaked and shared on 4chan, along with instructions to Trump fans to flood the lines with garbage calls so that they were so clogged that they couldn't efficiently run the count for the Iowa caucuses, and that became a major pastime for Trump trolls. This was reported at first, I think, by, the first one I think I logged away here was from Bloomberg, but others have picked up on the subject and written about it all day yesterday. NBC News confirming the story, lots of other outlets doing it as well. And McClatchy, I think, was the one that finally connected it to 4chan. And then I saw somebody tweeting yesterday that, oh my God, what the reporters interested in the story apparently found out, oh, well, it was shared on 4chan. And so they just credulously went to 4chan and put their names and numbers up and said, if you've participated in this or saw anything about it, I'd love to talk to you about it for our news story, and here's my number. And that's just like suicide. And somebody was tweeting, if this is the way that our political news media deals with disinformation, we're doomed forever. They're just never going to be able to understand this thing, and they're just going to become perpetual victims of it. That brings us to the story that I thought I might spend the rest of the day on, and which is getting lots of attention around the internet and elsewhere in the Atlantic from McKay Coppins, the billion-dollar disinformation campaign to reelect the president. How new technologies and techniques pioneered by dictators will shape the 2020 election. And this is scaring the crap out of everybody who's reading it. And so here we go. Maybe you've already read it and you don't need to have the crap scared out of you. But let's do it anyway. I don't know. I think this is an important one. One day last fall, I sat down to create a new Facebook account, says McKay Coppins. I picked a forgettable name, snapped a profile pic with my face obscured, and clicked like on the official pages of Donald Trump and his re-election campaign. Facebook's algorithm prodded me to follow Ann Coulter, Fox Business, and a variety of fan pages with names like In Trump We Trust. I complied. I also gave my cell phone number to the Trump campaign and joined a handful of private Facebook groups for MAGA diehards, one of which required an application that seemed designed to screen out interlopers. The president's re-election campaign was then in the midst of a multi-million-dollar ad blitz aimed at shaping Americans' understanding of the recently launched impeachment proceedings. Thousands of micro-targeted ads had flooded the internet, portraying Trump as a heroic reformer cracking down on foreign corruption, while Democrats plotted a coup. Now we know a little bit better about the backstory. That won't help you, though. That's the point of this story. That this narrative bore little resemblance to reality seemed only to accelerate its spread. Right-wing websites amplified every claim. Pro-Trump forums teemed with conspiracy theories. An alternative information ecosystem was taking shape around the biggest news story in the country, and I wanted to see it from the inside. I mean, this is not news to anybody that this exists, but this is just a report from what he saw and some warning about what's new about things. The story that unfurled in my Facebook feed over the next several weeks was at times disorienting. There were times when I would watch live on TV an impeachment hearing filled with damning testimony about the president's conduct, only to look at my phone later and find a slickly edited video served up by the Trump campaign that used out-of-context clips to recast the same testimony as an exoneration. Wait, I caught myself wondering more than once, is that what happened today? As I swiped at my phone, a stream of pro-Trump propaganda filled the screen. That's right, the whistleblower's own lawyer said, the coup has started. Swipe. Democrats are doing Putin's bidding. Imagine that, right? Swipe. The only message these radical socialists and extremists will understand is a crushing. Swipe. Only one man can stop this chaos. Swipe, swipe, swipe. I was surprised by the effect it had on me. I'd assumed that my skepticism and media literacy would inoculate me against such distortions, but soon found myself reflexively questioning every headline. It wasn't that I believed Trump and his boosters were telling the truth. It was that, in this state of heightened suspicion, truth itself about Ukraine, impeachment, or anything else felt more and more difficult to locate. With each swipe, the notion of observable reality drifted further out of reach. And this is a fairly sophisticated actor here, McKay Coppins, writing about this. What I was seeing was a strategy that had been deployed by illiberal political leaders around the world. Rather than shutting down dissenting voices, these leaders have learned to harness the democratizing power of social media for their own purposes, jamming the signals, sowing confusion. They no longer need to silence dissidents shouting in the streets. They can use a megaphone to drown them out. Scholars have a name for this: censorship through noise. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Networks Radio. Wow, so much happening here, and I do want to continue with the reading of this, but I guess two more things I'll enter into the record for sharing with you. Stories that we really should be spending time on, but that we won't be able to. New developments in the watch on Trump's emboldenment after his acquittal. One is the story, how do we put this? So one is the story of, I guess, the shadow investigation that has been underway for some time now in the Republican-controlled Senate, where Chuck Grassley, I think, is behind this request. They've been using the Finance Committee there in the Senate to reinforce the charge related to what we've been spending on our time on today. Reinforce the charge that Hunter Biden was up to no good in Ukraine and there was massive corruption going on there, even though we know the money dwarfs anything that actually went on in corruption in the Ukraine. And what they've done is they've been making requests of the Treasury Department, asking them to send them information on any suspicious banking activity by Hunter Biden. But in particular, it should be pointed out, they're looking for suspicious activity reports, which ordinarily are not shared outside of law enforcement because they don't have to be based on anything in particular, just a suspicion. It never rises to the level of a serious enough accusation to actually charge anybody with a crime. It's just if you think something funny might be going on with this account, you report it, and then we look into it. And if we look into it and we find something, then we do something with it, then we generate another sort of report or charges against such a person. But the Finance Committee, I guess, wants to get a hold, I don't know if it was the Finance Committee or not now that I think about it, but these senators were interested in getting a hold of these normally closely held and confidential suspicious activity reports in furtherance of their accusations against the Bidens, and where normally you would not get a hold of those things, and you certainly wouldn't get them very quickly. And while the same department has been stonewalling Democratic requests, for instance, for Donald Trump's tax returns, which they're required to provide by law, they've been stonewalling that, but they're turning this stuff around in days and weeks, where everybody else has to wait months for a rejection letter. So not only handing over materials that they don't ordinarily release, but doing so in expedited fashion for Republicans and fighting tooth and nail on everything for Democrats. Another abuse of power for which Trump should basically face impeachment, but who knows what will happen. But that's been circulating for a couple of days, and apparently there's a new one out there. Greg Sargent says he says, here's a new abuse of power by Trump that should alarm you. One he found out about by speaking with Senator Chris Murphy. It says here, who has called on the Government Accountability Office, GAO, to undertake a review of whether the administration is over-classifying government information in order to keep it hidden from public view to protect Trump. It's a new story, but not a new tactic necessarily. Of course, that's exactly what would have been going on with the over-redacting of the emails between OMB and DOD with respect to the Ukraine bribery situation. But just brought out to the fore again by Senator Chris Murphy and Greg Sargent, and something to think about, that and the Treasury handling these things. By the way, I mean, at this point, do you put it past the Trump administration to say, well, what if, since the suspicious activity reports don't actually have any legal weight and we don't usually circulate them for that reason, what does it take to generate such a report? It's just generalized suspicion, and it can be from maybe an anonymous source. What about if you released all the suspicious activity reports on Hunter Biden to us? That would be helpful. And what if the Treasury then comes back and says, you know what? There aren't any suspicious activity reports with respect to Hunter Biden, actually. What if the directive was, well, make some. Put some old dates on it, too. You know, you could make them now, I guess. If you put some old dates on it, people will probably believe it. But you don't need to have any paper trail for these things? Not really, but that's why we don't release them. Well, I think you should release them anyway, and why don't you make some that say he's totally suspicious, and then we'll just say, look, see, even the government thinks he's, not me, the government thinks he's suspicious. Don't put it past him. Don't have to. He's already doing it. I promise you. They'll find suspicious activity on behalf of Hunter Biden that Hunter Biden will claim he knows nothing about, and we'll say, oh, sure, yeah, right. Oh, it's a conspiracy theory. The whole government is united against you. Well, under Donald Trump, that is not hard to picture. Anyway, as I was saying, I want to go back to Kay Coppins in The Atlantic to talk about another sort of disinformation campaign that's going on that will probably, once you get through more of it, give you room to believe that the suspicious activity report maneuver is entirely possible. And maybe they don't even have to be the ones to fake it up. After the 2016 election, he says, much was made of the threats posed to American democracy by foreign disinformation. Stories of Russian troll farms and Macedonian fake news mills loomed in the national imagination. But while these shadowy outside forces preoccupied politicians and journalists, Trump and his domestic allies were beginning to adopt the same tactics of information warfare that have kept the world's demagogues and strongmen in power. Every presidential campaign sees its share of spin and misdirection, but this year's contest promises to be different. In conversations with political strategists and other experts, a dystopian picture of the general election comes into view, one shaped by coordinated bot attacks, Potemkin local news sites, micro-targeted fear-mongering, and anonymous mass texting. That's a new one. Both parties will have these tools at their disposal, but in the hands of a president who lies constantly, who traffics in conspiracy theories, and who readily manipulates the levers of government for his own gain, their potential to wreak havoc is enormous. The Trump campaign is planning to spend more than $1 billion, and it will be aided by a vast coalition of partisan media, outside political groups, and enterprising freelance operatives. These pro-Trump forces are poised to wage what could be the most extensive disinformation campaign in U.S. history. Whether or not it succeeds in re-electing the president, the wreckage it leaves behind could be irreparable. Next section here called The Death Star. The campaign is run from the 14th floor of a gleaming modern office tower in Rosslyn, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. If you want to look it up, it's Rosslyn, pronounced Rosslyn, or Roslyn even sometimes. Glass-walled conference rooms look out over the Potomac River. Rows of sleek monitors line the main office space. Unlike the bootstrap operation that first got Trump elected, with its motley band of B-teamers toiling in an unfinished space in Trump Tower, and paying rent on it, no less, his 2020 enterprise is heavily funded, technologically sophisticated, and staffed with dozens of experienced operatives. One Republican strategist referred to it admiringly as the Death Star. Presiding over the effort is Brad Parscale, The 6'8" Viking of a man, you probably even shouldn't do him that courtesy, with a shaved head and a triangular beard. As the digital director of Trump's 2016 campaign, Pascal didn't become a household name like Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway, but he played a crucial role in delivering Trump to the Oval Office, and his efforts will shape this year's election. In speeches and in interviews, Pascal likes to tell his life story as a tidy rags-to-riches tale embroidered with Trumpian embellishments. He grew up a simple farm boy from Kansas. Red, of course, son of an affluent lawyer from suburban Topeka, who managed to graduate from an Ivy League school, actually Trinity University in San Antonio. After college, he went to work for a software company in California, only to watch the business collapse in the economic aftermath of 9/11, not to mention allegations in a lawsuit that he and his parents, who owned the business, had illegally transferred company funds, claims that they disputed. Broke and desperate, Pascal took his last $500, not counting the value of 3 rental properties he owned, and used it to start a one-man web design business in Texas. This is very interesting. If we don't get to it, and we probably won't, down toward the bottom, I think, in this piece, they explain that sort of weird back and forth about his rags to riches story. And how could it be that if he says he's a farm boy? Well, you were the son of an affluent lawyer from Topeka. You went to an Ivy League school. Trinity University in San Antonio may be a fine institution, but it's not an Ivy League school. How do you say such things? When he's confronted about it, he basically says, it's my story. I get to tell it the way I want. That's all there is to it. That's his entire justification. Pascal Media, the little website upstart in Texas that he started, right? By most accounts, a scrappy endeavor at the outset. Hustling to drum up clients, Pascal cold-pitched shoppers in the tech aisle of a Borders bookstore. Over time, he built enough websites for plumbers and gun shops that bigger clients took notice, including the Trump Organization. How? I'll have no idea. In 2011, Pascal was invited to bid on designing a website for Trump International Realty. An ardent fan of The Apprentice, he offered to do the job for $10,000, a fraction of the actual cost. I just made up a price, he later told the Washington Post. I recognized that I was a nobody in San Antonio, but working for the Trumps would be everything. The contract was his, and a lucrative relationship was born. Over the next 4 years, he was hired to design websites for a range of Trump ventures, a winery, where I think I remember finding the screenshot of them offering in the gift shop glassware for sale, Glasswear. Anyway, the winery, the skincare line, and then a presidential campaign. By late 2015, Pascal, a man with no discernible politics, let alone campaign experience, was running the Republican frontrunner's digital operation from his personal laptop. Pascal slid comfortably into Trump's orbit. Not only was he cheap and unpretentious, with no hint of the savvier-than-thou smugness that characterized other political operatives, but he seemed to carry a chip on his shoulder that matched the candidates. Brad was one of those people who wanted to prove the establishment wrong and show the world what he was made of, says a former colleague from the campaign. Perhaps most important, he seemed to have no reservations about the kind of campaign Trump wanted to run. The race-baiting, the immigrant-bashing, the truth-bending, none of it seemed to bother Pascal. While some Republicans wrung their hands over Trump's inflammatory messages, Pascal came up with ideas to more effectively disseminate them. The campaign had little interest at first in cutting-edge ad technology, and for a while, Pascal's most valued contribution was the merchandise page he built to sell MAGA hats. But that changed in the general election. Outgunned on the airwaves and lagging badly in fundraising, campaign officials turned to Google and Facebook, where ads were inexpensive and shock value was rewarded. As the campaign poured tens of millions into online advertising, amplifying themes such as Hillary Clinton's criminality and the threat of radical Islamic terrorism, Pascal's team, which was christened Project Alamo, grew to 100. Pascal was generally well liked by his colleagues, who recall him as a competent and intensely focused person. He was a get crap done type of person, says A.J. Delgado, who worked with him. She didn't make out all that well from the campaign as far as I recall. Anyway, perhaps just as important, he had a talent for ingratiating himself with the Trump family. He was probably better at managing up. Kurt Luidhart, a consultant for the campaign, told me he made sure to share credit for his work with the candidate's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. and he excelled at using Trump's digital ignorance to flatter him. Pascal would come in and tell Trump he didn't need to listen to the polls because he'd crunched his data and they were going to win by 6 points, one former campaign staffer told me. I was like, come on, man. Don't BS a BSer, although we already used the word today, but what the hell. But Trump seemed to buy it. Pascal declined to be interviewed for this story, by the way. James Barnes, a Facebook employee who was dispatched to work closely with the campaign, told me Pascal's political inexperience made him open to experimenting with the platform's new tools. Whereas some grizzled campaign strategists who'd been around the block a few times might say, oh, that'll never work, Brad's predisposition was to say, yeah, let's try it. From June to November, Trump's campaign ran 5.9 million ads on Facebook, while Clinton ran just 66,000. A Facebook executive would later write in a leaked memo that Trump, quote, got elected because he ran the single best digital ad campaign I've ever seen from any advertiser, unquote. You know they'll love that. Though some strategies questioned how much these ads actually mattered, Pascal was hailed for Trump's surprise victory. Stories appeared in the press calling him a genius and the campaign's secret weapon, though for a while they as I recall, they leaned on Jared Kushner as the genius and secret weapon. But so they were right about his sharing the credit. In 2018, he was tapped to lead the entire re-election effort. The promotion was widely viewed as a sign that the president's 2020 strategy would hinge on digital tactics that Pascal had mastered. Through it all, the strategist has continued to show a preference for narrative over truth. Last May, Pascal regaled a crowd of donors and activists in Miami with the story of his ascent. When ProPublica reporters confronted him about the many misleading details in his account, he shrugged off the fact check. When I give a speech, I like to tell a story, he said. My story is my story. Next up, disinformation architecture. In his book, This Is Not Propaganda, Peter Pomerantsev, a researcher at the London School of Economics, writes about a young Filipino political consultant he calls P. In college, P had studied the Little Albert experiment, in which scientists conditioned a young child to fear furry animals by exposing him to loud noises every time he encountered a white lab rat. Great experiment. I hope that was from long ago. Anyway, the experiment gave P an idea. He created a series of Facebook groups for Filipinos to discuss what was going on in their communities. Once the groups got big enough, about 100,000 members, he began posting local crime stories and instructed his employees to leave comments falsely tying the grisly headlines to drug cartels. The pages lit up with frightened chatter. Rumors swirled. Conspiracy theories metastasized. To many, all crimes became drug crimes. Unbeknownst to their members, the Facebook groups were designed to boost Rodrigo Duterte, then a long-shot presidential candidate running on a pledge to brutally crack down on drug criminals. Duterte once boasted that as mayor of Davao City, he rode through the streets on his motorcycle and personally executed drug dealers. Do you really believe it? I don't know. Maybe. P's experiment was one plank in a larger disinformation architecture, which also included social media influencers paid to mock opposing candidates. I'd love to have that job, by the way. And mercenary trolls working out of former call centers that experts say aided Duterte's rise to power. Since assuming office in 2016, Duterte has reportedly ramped up those efforts while presiding over thousands of extrajudicial killings. The campaign in the Philippines was emblematic of an emerging propaganda playbook, one that uses new tools for the age-old ends of autocracy. The Kremlin has long been an innovator in this area. A 2011 manual for Russian civil servants favorably compared their methods of disinformation to an invisible radiation, that's an interesting concept, that takes effect while the population doesn't even feel it is being acted upon. The victims of most of this disinformation are sure they're not victims, of course, but that you are for accusing them. But with the technological advances of the past decade and the global proliferation of smartphones, governments around the world have found success deploying Kremlin-honed techniques against their own people. In the United States, we tend to view such tools of oppression as the faraway problems of more fragile democracies, but the people working to re-elect Trump understand the power of these tactics. They may use gentler terminology, muddy the waters, alternative facts. But they're building a machine designed to exploit their own sprawling disinformation architecture. Central to that effort is the campaign's use of micro-targeting, the process of slicing up the electorate into distinct niches and then appealing to them with precisely tailored digital messages. The advantages of this approach are obvious. An ad that calls for defunding Planned Parenthood might get a mixed response from a large national audience, but serve it directly via Facebook to 800 Roman Catholic women in Dubuque, Iowa, and its reception will be much more positive. If candidates once had to shout their campaign promises from a soapbox, micro-targeting allows them to sidle up to millions of voters and whisper personalized messages in their ear. Pascal didn't invent this practice. Barack Obama's campaign famously used it in 2012, as Clinton's followed suit. But Trump's effort in 2016 was unprecedented in both its scale and its brazenness. In the final days of the 2016 race, for example, Trump's team tried to suppress turnout among black voters in Florida by slipping ads into their news feeds that read, "Hillary thinks African Americans are super predators." An unnamed campaign official boasted to Bloomberg Businessweek that it was one of the 3 major voter suppression operations underway, the other 2 targeting young women and white liberals. The weaponization of micro-targeting was pioneered in large part by the data scientists at Cambridge Analytica. The firm began as part of a nonpartisan military contractor that used digital psyops to target terrorist groups and drug cartels. Good stuff, I would say. In Pakistan, it worked to thwart jihadist recruitment efforts. In South America, it circulated disinformation to turn drug dealers against their bosses. The emphasis shifted once the conservative billionaire Robert Mercer became a major investor and installed Steve Bannon as his point man. Using a massive trove of data it had gathered from Facebook and other sources without users' consent, Cambridge Analytica worked to develop detailed psychographic profiles for every voter in the U.S. and began experimenting with ways to stoke paranoia and bigotry by exploiting certain personality traits. In one exercise, the firm asked white men whether they would approve of their daughter marrying a Mexican immigrant. Those who said yes were asked a follow-up question designed to provoke irritation at the constraints of political correctness. The question was, did you feel like you had to say that? Christopher Wiley, who was the director of research at Cambridge Analytica and later testified about the company to Congress, told me that with the right kind of nudges, people who exhibited certain psychological characteristics could be pushed into ever more extreme beliefs and conspiratorial thinking. Rather than using data to interfere with the process of radicalization, Steve Bannon was able to invert that, Wiley said. We were essentially seeding an insurgency in the United States. Cambridge Analytica, of course, was dissolved in 2018, shortly after its CEO was caught on tape bragging about using bribery and sexual honey traps on behalf of clients. The firm denied that it actually used such tactics. Since then, some political scientists have questioned how much effect that psychographic targeting really had. But Wiley, who spoke with me from London, where he now works for H&M as a fashion trend forecaster, said the firm's work in 2016 was a modest test run compared for what could come. What happens if North Korea or Iran picks up where Cambridge Analytica left off, he said, noting that plenty of foreign actors will be looking for ways to interfere in this year's election. There are countless hostile states that have more than enough capacity to quickly replicate what we were able to do and make it much more sophisticated. These efforts may not come only from abroad. A group of former Cambridge Analytica employees have formed a new firm that, according to the Associated Press, is working with the Trump campaign. The firm denies it, of course, and the campaign spokesperson declined to comment. After Cambridge Analytica's scandal broke, Facebook was excoriated for mishandling of user data and complicity in the viral spread of fake news. Mark Zuckerberg promised to do better, rolled out a flurry of reforms, but then last fall he handed a major victory to lying politicians. Candidates, he said, would be allowed to continue running false ads on Facebook. Commercial advertisers, by contrast, are subject to fact-checking. In a speech at Georgetown University, the CEO argued that his company shouldn't be responsible for arbitrating political speech, and that because political ads already receive so much scrutiny, candidates who choose to lie will be held accountable by journalists and watchdogs. To bolster his case, Zuckerberg pointed to the recently launched and publicly accessible library where Facebook archives every political ad it publishes. The project has a certain democratic appeal. Why censor false or toxic content when a little sunlight can have the same effect? But spend some time scrolling through the archive of Trump re-election ads, and you quickly see the limits of this transparency. The campaign doesn't just run one ad at a time on a given theme. It runs hundreds of iterations, sometimes thousands, adjusting the language, the music, even the colors of the donate buttons. In the 10 weeks after the House of Representatives began its impeachment inquiry, the Trump campaign ran roughly 14,000 different ads containing the word impeachment. Sifting through all of them is virtually impossible. Both parties will rely on micro-targeted ads this year, but the president is likely to have a distinct advantage. The RNC and the Trump campaign have reportedly compiled an average of 3,000 data points on every voter in America. They have spent years experimenting with ways to tweak their message based not just on gender and geography, but on whether the recipient owns a gun or watches the Golf Channel. While these ads can be used to try to win over undecided voters, they're most often deployed for fundraising and for firing up the faithful. And Trump's advisors believe this election will be decided by mobilization, not persuasion. So, by the way, does Rachel Bidikoff, who was the subject, I should share this with you too, of a big profile in Politico just the other day, explaining her negative partisanship theory. To turn out the base, the campaign has signaled that it will return to familiar themes, the threat of illegal aliens, a term Pascal has reportedly encouraged Trump to use, and the corruption of the swamp. Beyond Facebook, the campaign is also investing in texting platforms that could allow it to send anonymous messages directly to millions of voters' phones without their permission. Until recently, people had to opt in before a campaign could include them in a mass text, but with new peer-to-peer texting apps, including ones developed by Gary Kobe, a senior Trump advisor, a single volunteer can send hundreds of messages an hour, skirting federal regulations by clicking send one message at a time. Notably, these messages aren't required to disclose who's behind them, thanks to a 2002 ruling, amazingly enough, by the Federal Election Commission that cited the limited number of characters available in a text. Most experts assume that these regulations will be overhauled sometime after the 2020 election, after a new scandal, I guess. For now, campaigns from both parties are hoovering up as many cell phone numbers as possible, and Pascal has said texting will be at the center of Trump's re-election strategy. The medium's ability to reach voters is unparalleled. While robocalls get sent to voicemail and email blasts get trapped in spam folders, peer-to-peer texting companies say that at least 90% of their messages are opened. The Trump campaign's texts so far this cycle have focused on shouty fundraising pleas. They have nothing. Impeachment is over. Now let's crush our end-of-the-month goal. Oh, and also them. But the potential for misuse by outside groups is clear, and shady political actors are already discovering how easy it is to wage an untraceable whisper campaign by text. In 2018, as early voting got underway in Tennessee's Republican gubernatorial primary, voters began receiving text messages attacking two of the candidates' conservative credentials. The texts, written in a conversational style, as if they'd been sent from a friend, were unsigned, and people who tried calling the numbers received a busy signal. The local press covered the smear campaign. Law enforcement was notified, but the sources of the texts was never discovered. Now, the next section, which begins here, and we will no longer have time to read, you're familiar with the basics of war on the press. We've talked a lot about that. Let's see, what are the other subject headings do we not get to here? Digital dirty tricks comes up next. Scrolling further down, fighting fire with fire. Will Democrats allow themselves to use the same tactics in return? The answer is probably not. Then, of course, the powers of incumbency. And the thing we've always feared from all of this, the section down at the bottom, probably the next most important, should have skipped down to that at some point earlier. Nothing is true. In other words, the undermining of truth itself, or even the concept that there could be objective truth about things that's discernible by reading the news or surfing the web or investigating facts or impeaching the president or what have you. It's all up in the air. No one can tell what reality really is. So after all, why shouldn't you just take your advice on what's really happening in the world and who you should vote for, or whether or not Trump is really guilty, or whether it was really Hunter and Joe Biden all along, from anonymous texts that show up without the attribution and that are untraceable. It's a really alarming article, of course. There's lots more to it. We may or may not spend some additional time on it. We may move on to other topics for Monday, but that you got your reading ahead of you for the weekend. And if you haven't had enough information, or you want a new angle on some of the information you got here, of course, Justice Putnam brings us the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next, and let's take a look at what he's got on tap for you. Jim Jordan badgered FBI Director Wray for not taking his unbalanced showboating rant seriously enough. Then, on the rest of the menu, most rural hospital closures are in states that refuse to expand Medicaid. After brazenly acquitting Trump of his obvious and overt crimes, Republicans get back to the hard work of investigating Hillary Clinton's emails. Can you believe that's back?
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Here's another major story we missed so far. A Senate report criticized the Obama administration for its handling of the 2016 Russia election meddling without mentioning Moscow Mitch's threats and obstruction. How could that possibly happen? And of course, lots of news internationally as well, which is what makes the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy so special. Stay tuned.